Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Hope you all enjoyed the first couple panels from the Crypto Psychedelic Conference. If you are seeing us, chime in on the chat there, make sure everything's coming through correctly. We're really happy to be here and reflect on the things we did 3 years ago. A quick acknowledgement first. We were initially going to be joined by Oriana for this panel, but she had a tragic, unexpected death in her family, and unfortunately was not able to join us here today. So we're all sending our love and prayers towards Oriana and her family. Thank you, everybody, for being here with us. I still have a pretty awesome group of folks here that I'm getting to hang out with again on the virtual stage. We were all on one panel or the other that you just watched. So coming back is Sara, Gael, and Betty Aldworth and Ismail Ali. And we're here now after watching the videos from this thing we did 3 years ago. We're here to reflect a little bit on it, what's changed, what's remained the same. And we're also here to answer your questions. So in Crowdcast, if it's your first time using Crowdcast, there's an Ask a Question feature. It's on the bottom of the screen. And if you click on the Ask a Question feature, that's where you can ask us questions. And you can also, within the same interface, upvote the ones that you like the most. And so we're going to take the questions that are the most popular. And so as folks are getting their questions in, we're just going to start the conversation here amongst ourselves. And we're going to make it pretty roundtable format. And I invite all my co-panelists here to chime in as you see fit. And maybe the first thing we should do actually is give updates personally. You know, some folks have changed positions. So what's going on? Where are you now since 3 years ago?
I can go first because it's the least. I'm in exactly the same position I was in 3 years ago in every possible way, mentally, psychologically. No, I'm just kidding. I actually am still working as policy counsel at MAPS. Has continued to expand and evolve in so many ways. I will say that I guess the biggest difference is that a lot of the conversations that we had 3 years ago are much more real in a way that they haven't been, and I think much more tangible in a way that I'm sure we'll be talking about today, but otherwise still participating in that way. So glad to be back, glad to be here.
I can go next. Yeah, so actually a fair amount has changed for me since this was filmed, since CryptoPsychedelic. So I was director of harm reduction for the Zendo project at MAPS at that time. And over the past 9 months, I've transitioned into an officer position at MAPS. So I'm now working part-time still in the harm reduction department and still doing the MDMA assisted psychotherapy. So still working on that in phase 3. So that is the same, although we were on a bit of a hiatus due to COVID for the past 9 months. I think that those are kind of the major updates and changes. We'll talk a little bit more about what those changes within Zendo project have been since 3 years ago. Good to see you all or feel you all and be here.
As for me, I'm still here to empty prisons, but now I'm doing it in a bit of a different way. I've joined the cabal at MAPS, where I am now the director of communications and events. So I'm working on media relations, putting together our next psychedelic science conference. So watch the bulletin for the save the date on that one. And primarily working on the bulletin, MAPS published books and other educational efforts with Sara, Izzy, and the team over there.
Nice. Yeah, this wasn't planned, but as it turns out, the three of you are all currently at MAPS, although you all have experience in a lot of other domains as well, you know, working on policy and harm reduction. And so bringing in not only the MAPS hat, but many other experience bands that you're drawing from for this. And I guess as for me, I'm still largely doing the same type of work, just maybe under a different banner. At the time of the CryptoPsychedelic Summit, I was one of the directors of Symposia, and presently I'm working under the project you're watching right now. We're under the Psychedelic Seminars platform, which actually, as it turns out, is when I started the first project I started in this community, which initially was a local community in Baltimore. And kind of post CryptoPsychedelic, about 3 years ago, I resuscitated it and started doing events that were they were in person at one point, but they were always actually live streamed too, and now they're just entirely live streamed. So things have evolved in a lot of ways, and I've certainly mostly adapted to the times. But I'm doing the same type of work myself, though, doing public events, helping to build communities. So a lot of us are still just carrying onwards with the same mission that we've always been pretty aligned on. More broadly than on the personal side for everyone here, as you're watching the videos and seeing what you said or what others said in these panels from 3 years ago, is there anything in particular that sticks out that either something has changed or things that you watched and you said, oh yeah, that's still true? What came up as you're watching the replays?
Well, we started the panel without you all in the green room a few minutes ago, and so I guess we can start here a little bit. It caused the rewatch caused me to think a lot about how it takes a combination of inside action and outside action to change systems, right? Like recognizing that these systems typically are so much larger than, or smaller than, perhaps, I think many of us would argue, than psychedelics in the psychedelic community, but they are very stable and difficult to change. And so creating change requires both working within the systems very frequently and without them. Sara likened it to incremental action, i.e. within, versus revolutionary action, which pretty much always is taking place from without. That outside action, sanctioned versus unsanctioned. One of the things that we talked about there is what does it take to be able to show up in systems based in system structures, right? So what does it take to be able to show up and be taken seriously in Congress, in mainstream cultural and governmental spaces or academic spaces, and that's shifting, not quickly enough, but that's shifting. We still have to sort of put on the suit and in many ways perform. And one of the things that was really interesting to me about that advocacy panel in the context of the work that Sara is doing right now is that Zendo, in so many ways, was an outside action response to an existing need that is being addressed, or that is being addressed to some extent through MAPS's work and others in regulating psychedelics. But Sara's work with Zendo has been about supporting people who are using psychedelics outside of the sanctioned systems. And today, though, Sara is taking that work and is bringing it into sanctioned systems and informing those sanctioned systems through everything that she's learned on the outside, right? Bringing the outside in, and that's super powerful. So, Sara, can you tell us a bit about how that experience has been for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I'll start with a little bit of reflection and then weave into what you were speaking to. So, yeah, I feel like 3 years ago, it was almost like there was this little calm right before the storm. Like things have just gotten, in the, 6+ years that I've been at MAPS, seeing the organization grow and seeing the movement grow. And it just feels like this was a moment in time during this conference. It was right before things got really big, right? This psychedelic renaissance started to really grow. Almost like it felt like an exponential shift, I think, in the past few years. And so, I was on the panel talking about research, but also talking about harm reduction. And I think it's been really interesting for me over the years to be involved in both areas, to be doing the clinical research, to be working as a therapist on a study, and then also to be doing the Zendo work and working in the recreational spaces, and to see how they've impacted and informed one another. I think, to what you're speaking to, Betty, so one of the biggest shifts for me, and this is actually it's related to MAPS, but it's also not. So in 2019, sorry, not 2019, where am I? 2020, in Denver, they decriminalized psilocybin. And so as part of that initiative that was passed, the mayor put together a panel of people who would help inform policies over the coming years of how psilocybin mushrooms would be regulated in the city of Denver. And I live here in Boulder, Colorado. And so it was, as part of that panel, I was brought on as a harm reduction advocate. So now I'm like stepping into Izzy's world, right? Like no experience at all in politics. And all of a sudden I'm sitting on this, this panel that is really focused on regulation and looking at, what does it mean for something, to be, and Izzy will likely speak more to this, hopefully too, in your share, the work that you've been doing too around decriminalization. So, how do we help support and guide regulation with these new decriminalized substances? So one of the things in Denver that I've been really focused on the panel is helping to integrate psychedelic harm reduction training into the city of Denver first responders. So what that means is taking everything that we've learned over the years at festivals and events with Zendo and taking them out into society and teaching law enforcement, paramedics. In Denver, there's a really good mental health co-responders unit that goes out both with paramedics as well as with law enforcement. So we're working, and then sheriff's department and fire department. And we're working to do a multi-responder training for the city of Denver that has been, as passed down from part of this panel, this initiative. And, we never would have been able to do that, to be where we're at, if it hadn't been for decriminalization, to get the city of Denver to actually get on board with a citywide mandate and working to help train these responders. It just would have taken forever. So it's been really inspiring to work in Denver here and to see how much these different departments that we're working with are really on board with this training. I think one thing in Denver that they saw is that when with cannabis, there was a huge uptick of tourism, right? When that passed here in Denver. And so that brought actually people who were coming here for cannabis tourism, having challenging experiences on cannabis. And they did see an uptick in response calls and incidents involving cannabis. And so when we brought this to the city, they were like, well, they had already had that experience. And so they saw the importance of bringing a training like this. And I think one thing that I really believe about MAPS's work in harm reduction is that it was never meant to stay in the festivals. I see festivals and events as these microcosms, as these places where we can learn and grow and experiment and take that knowledge and take what we learn together in that community atmosphere and environment, and actually take that out into the world. And so the idea here in Denver is that this will be a pilot program, a training pilot program, and that eventually it could be a model that could be also replicated in other cities and states as decriminalization continues to roll out. So
that's amazing.
Yeah, and I'd love to, hear, and Izzy too, your reflections, but also if there's anything that you want to speak to regarding the work that you and your department's been doing with Decrypt.
Yeah, I will. I have my notes are just completely wild. Listening to both of the panels earlier, and thinking about, I was saying this earlier, thinking about our audience at the time and who we were speaking to, which in that particular moment, because of who was there, was people who were already involved in crypto or new technologies, mostly people either with money or who had been supported by people who, sent us out. And thinking about how that, there's aspects of that audience that I think are very similar to the kinds of audiences that are being exposed to these issues now, in the sense that they are newer, what some people might call more mainstream, but more specifically kind of less, that had not up until that point been exposed to a lot of these ideas. There's a lot of people who are exposed to drugs and underground economies and so on, but they don't, it doesn't always come with that kind of social political consciousness that we totally injected. So it was such a really cool to reflect on our role in that particular event, which was bringing some of this ideas forward in this time where everyone was like really excited about cryptocurrency, really excited about blockchain, really thinking about the enormity of the possibility that could happen. Us, people in the psychedelic kind of movement space really thinking, oh, this very similar like momentum and excitement, and then also realizing that the things that were preventing either or both of these movements, and this is still true, from realizing their maximum potential is these social political kind of limitations that are both external and also ones that are generated by the people within them because of lack of imagination or a lack of kind of full spectrum harm reduction or full spectrum consciousness, as Boone might say. So it's really cool to kind of think about how the audience in general has expanded. I think because it's not necessarily the case anymore where people are only coming to psychedelics because they are interested in looking. Like now it's kind of permeated to a level of the mainstream where there are a lot of people who are, whether they're looking for it or not, are actually getting some of this information and starting to kind of seep that in a different way, which makes me think, Betty, related to your original point, that thinking about inside action, the work that happens within the system versus that's without or outside of the system, and how I think that 3 years ago that those two types of things felt really far apart. It felt like it was like there was like this particular sanctioned regulated legal strategy, or you had to do like civil disobedience or do something that looked like civil disobedience. And to this example that you were talking about, Sarah, I feel like the lines between inside action and outside action are becoming more blurred, or maybe just more narrow. And the way that we position ourselves relative to these systems is also changing. I think because of the increasing complexity and reality of like what's been occurring. So I think 3 years ago there were a lot of things that we were, as you've both said, like on the precipice of and thinking was possible, but hadn't necessarily started actualizing. The people who were involved in them started bringing things together, and the idea started culminating. But it wasn't until, as Sara said, like we had changes in the law in Oregon, changes in the law in multiple cities, in Oakland, in Denver, and so on. Like as the conversation around legal change started to expand and create more containers, and we knew this. This is something we did predict, I think, which is that once there was space for those communities and those projects to exist, that they would start emerging. That has actually happened, but now we're dealing with, I think, a whole other layer, which was not as present 3 years ago, which is the layer of industry and like the layer of, there was a lot of conversation at CryptoPsychedelic about funding, about philanthropy and giving and the need to give toward this. I think that the landscape in that sense has changed a lot, because now there's financial incentive and capacity that there was to some extent, but was still a little bit too far to really like predict into or project into for people to be comfortable. So I think that's a really big shift. And maybe I add one more thing and pause, but I thought a lot about, and this is actually related, I thought a lot about how we and I used the word community. And I think because of, for a long time, the drug policy reform movement and people who did psychedelics could see themselves to some extent as part of a community, of a counterculture community that was defined by its rejection of something. And I think because that identity is starting to dissipate as we get closer to the mainstream, and as the mainstream starts to come to us, either way, however you define it, how we think about community is really starting to change. And like, I think that it's getting harder to say that there's a psychedelic community that's based on people who do psychedelics. Like the fact that we're consuming something does not inherently bring us into a community. The fact that people are interested in a particular state of being or interested in a particular type of healing modalities alone is not really enough necessarily to say that we're definitely part of a community. So I think redefining and re-enlivening those boundaries so we can create these like communities of practice that then could create these kind of healing emergences that we talked about so much in a decentralized way, in a way that utilizes some of the infrastructure but doesn't rely on a particular type of system. I think that like openness and that shift is starting to occur, but it does require us to get a little bit clear about what boundaries we're setting for ourselves and for each other.
Yeah, and to draw some common threads about what all of you shared. Certainly the movement as a whole has changed a lot over the past 3 years. And to contextualize it here, this conference, the CryptoPsychedelic Summit, initially was 3 years ago. So it was February 2018. This was right before Michael Pollan's book came out. And so you can kind of track the movement very closely with that as a big inflection point, right? When that book came out, all of a sudden this kind of mainstreaming of psychedelics became much bigger. And that's around the same time when so many of these psychedelic startups started showing up. And, as Izzy pointed to, the time we were talking about psychedelic community and psychedelic research and advocacy, there's a lot of philanthropy, and there still is. But today that's become a lot more about investment. And so there's a lot of new kind of forces at play. In some way, though, it sort of makes the conversation arguably maybe more relevant in the sense that, now the psychedelic community is having to have this deep conversation around the economy, right? How do the economic systems inform what's happening with psychedelics? And that's very much the same conversation that the blockchain and crypto world has been examining. What are the ways that the economic structures are serving or not? So in some way right now, it's a really interesting intersection to be thinking about. I actually curious if anyone has thoughts on that in particular, and or other ways in which you've kind of found intersections with the crypto community or the values of the world that since the original conference.
Mike, one of the things that I've been challenged by when thinking about the decentralized and crypto community is it is not clear to me how that that community, that the Bitcoin or cryptocurrency and decentralized community building doesn't replicate some of the elitism, the power and privilege placement, the concentration, and specifically concentration of wealth, like these things that we spoke about quite a lot during those panels 3 years ago. I don't see how those things aren't replicated very frequently within the decentralized communities, and I'm less connected to those than I am to many other communities, right? I have an awareness, but it's not my thing. And so maybe this question is actually, I'd love to turn this question back to you for a second here, because I'm curious, like when we look at things like, the thing that comes up really, the thing that comes up for me right now is this new app that everybody's very excited about called Clubhouse, and folks are, getting there by invite, but you have to have an iPhone, which I don't, and you have to be invited, and it seems to be replicating so many of those of the real world structures. Like, what do you see about decentralization and crypto that suggests to you or others that you're aware of that like this is a new way of being?
That is a great question. Thanks for bringing that up. I think you're honing in on something really important to name here, in that, in what way, the question being in what ways is cryptocurrency as we know it actually replicating some of the same problems of the old economic model. And I think it very much so is not some of the problems are being addressed, but other problems are being replicated. And in, like you named, concentration of wealth is certainly one of them. If you were an early adopter of cryptocurrency and you were hodling, you have a concentration of wealth relative to other people who didn't have access to the information that you did however many years ago. So it's a really that's a really important point. Not to mention something I've been thinking about a lot very recently, in particular, reading some of Charles Eisenstein's work actually around sacred economics, is the idea of ideally, right, you want your currency to be circulating. You want people to be creating value for each other. You want people to be you want to be matching gifts with needs. So you want all the gifts that we all have to offer to be matched to the people who need those gifts. And our current economic structure doesn't do a good job of doing that. And so a more ideal economic structure would do a better job of that thing, of matching gifts with needs. And I'm not convinced that a lot of the cryptocurrencies that exist presently are doing that, because they do encourage the hoarding more so than the giving, right? The idea of hodl to me is a little bit antithetical to the idea of actually circulating currency. Now, all that said, what I also find really interesting and compelling about cryptocurrency and blockchain is the idea that we can create our own rules for money. And what Bitcoin did as a proof of concept was that actually we can make money that has different rules. I don't think Bitcoin is the end of the game. But I think that we have a proof of concept that we can actually write new rules for the economy itself. So the question that I'm really interested in is, how can we use cryptocurrency and blockchain technology to rewrite the rules of the economy to make the economy itself more just? I don't think cryptocurrency today has done that, but I think that it potentially could move things that direction.
I would like to say something about rule writing. And who writes the rules and how we write rules, because that is really the conversation about policy and advocacy.
Please
right?
do.
Like,
Yeah.
Who writes them? Who enforces them? What are the rules here? What do I have to know? And we talked about it on the panel, right? About the set and setting conversation. Like, what's beyond just set and setting? What is the legal context? What are the rules? The cultural, political rules? What could be enforced on us with or without our consent? And just to bring it back to this conversation about psychedelics and policy and so on, I think that for many years, and certainly even up to the beginning of 2018, and this is related to what I was saying earlier, where there was this idea where because we are defining ourselves against this thing, we knew that the rules we wanted were not the rules that are currently there. And that's pretty much as far as we got. Like some people were thinking more, of course, like there's definitely way more thought than that, but I'm just saying culturally, there was like, okay, well, we don't like these rules. And now 3 years later, we're at a point where we're starting to figure out what rules we want to write. That's like part of what's happening. After Measure 109 and 110 passed in Oregon last November, there have been probably a dozen state representatives who've either mentioned that they want to do something about psychedelics or reaching out to organizations talking about psychedelics. Like really the beginning of that kind of momentum is like really here, especially following the election last year. So now we're actually starting to figure out what we want to say and like what we want to be created. And I was reflecting at the end of last year about how much tension and conflict there has been over the last 2 years, especially among, various communities that are doing different kinds of policy work and their perspective on, what we were just talking about, the economics of it, the influence or lack thereof of corporate or, related interests. But also, our basic understandings of like who and which drugs and how do we legalize or decriminalize and in what order and like what's the strategy. Like the movement kind of grew up. Like it's now big enough to have real policy disagreements within itself. Like for a long time, there was kind of this sense where we're like, there's a united front because it's the united front against that guy or that thing. And now that we're getting put into a position of responsibility, we're actually having to like decide what we want to happen. And like it's in some ways it's disheartening because it's sad to see like the kind of rapid in some cases and really deep kind of tension and lack of trust that I think has emerged in some of the movement spaces that already exist. But it has also shown that we are now ready to there's a level of maturity that the movement is actually having where it can have real deep policy disagreements and actually have a public, visible, ongoing dialogue about what to do about some of these things, whether it's corporate influence, whether it's ethics, whether it's there's a lot of these different things that are up, and whether it's about strategy. So I think that point of yes, we can make our own rules about things doesn't get us away from the fact that we still need to figure out what rules we want and how we enforce them. And I think that's where it's helpful to kind of differentiate, what's the work around enforcement. That's where I see like abolition and policing and like a lot of this work around policing especially and criminalization has to do with like how do we enforce whatever rules there are. And then simultaneously there's a process of being like, well, what rules would we be willing to enforce by force, knowing that is how that they're currently enforced? And that's a hard thing to say. It's like creating new rules in an environment where the only way for them to be enforced is through force and violence and coercion. puts people who are doing advocacy work in a really complex place. And it's like trying to balance those things at the same time can be difficult. So
that's a really important point. And actually, I'm going to reference myself from 3 years ago, as I talked about this exact point on the panel we just watched, the idea that, are there alternatives to this idea of enforcement, this idea of punishing people for doing the bad thing? Instead, can we develop models where we are really encouraging and incentivizing people and pointing people towards, the safe containers? Let's talk about Oregon Measure 109, for example, that you just brought up. And so, Oregon Measure 109, for those who don't know, is the measure in Oregon that is creating psilocybin services. And one of the critiques of Measure 109 was that it was going to create this sort of licensing structure and this idea, this question about rules, right? Who gets to be therapist? Who gets to decide who's a valid state-sanctioned therapist? And that's actually a critique that I agree with. I think overall, I'm not sad that the thing passed. I think it's going to move things forward. But I think the critique is very valid. And what I would like to see is, rather than legislators making these rules on the state or federal level, I'd rather personally see a system of a broadly defined decriminalization. And then, rather than having licenses and regulations that say, well, if you don't have this license, we're still going to arrest you, which is what's happening in cannabis. And guess who it is that doesn't get the licenses and still gets arrested? It's the same communities that have always been arrested. Instead of replicating that, old model in a new way, we can create professionals, and these are already in progress, right? Professional associations that can do certifications. If someone asks me, hey, where can I get psilocybin therapy? I just want to be able to point them to somewhere good. So if we can make it safe to show people where to get good care, that I think is a better model than using this traditional licensing I think is something you've said, at the end of any regulation is enforcement. And I think we can get away with that a little bit and move more towards, let's kind of show people, let's create the certification to go, hey, I know and trust this person. But maybe someone uses a different modality that we haven't gotten a certification for, and other people want to explore. I think we need that autonomy the same way. So giving people agency and autonomy for how they engage, while also being able to point people to keep them safe, to point them to the safe containers.
Fundamentally, right? Like, at the end of the day, I'm there with you about that, Mike. I think that there are very real and important considerations that we're already grappling with in this community, right? And some which we perhaps are not so much. But I think that one of the great things about the Oregon model is that it does explicitly state that there will be some sort of training or licensure system, but that can't require, if I remember correctly, that can't require an advanced degree, right? So there has to be some sort of, thanks, Izzy, for verifying. There are a lot of regulations in my head.
It's a high school diploma or higher. So people to get trained in Oregon, you have to have a high school diploma or higher, which is, you can go for it. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, so that's a way to make that licensure system more accessible, and also like make sure that people who are offering the service have some base level of training around how to deal with difficult experiences, how to know when you're in over your head, right? So that's one of the things that I'm particularly concerned about, having had myself a number of very negative experiences with therapists, but also having a lot of friends who have had negative experiences with licensed trained therapists who are at the state board, but don't quite know when they're in over their head. That's got to be part of it, right? Like there are knowing where to go for professional support, right? Having a network, a community of other people providing these services that provide support. All of those are issues that are aided by some sort of structure, wherein if you are trying to address a more serious underlying issue, you can go to someone who is more qualified for that. And I think that that is a fundamentally good thing. I'm interested to hear Sarah's response to all of that, but that, that's part of it. And then the other piece is that, people in psychedelic states are more vulnerable very frequently to any number of different notions. We talk about conspirituality. We can talk about, from the simplest, your friends play a funny trick on you to get you to believe something while you're in a non-ordinary state, to the very harmful consent violations that have, been the shame of our community for such an incredibly long time. So finding some balance in all of that, I think, is terrifically important, and some sort of, structure by which, if people are caused harm by a coach, a guide, a therapist, a licensed whomever, they are able to lodge a complaint that is legitimately and properly investigated, and that person's license is dealt with in an appropriate way. I think that's where I'm kind of okay with the how are we enforcing things question. I know, Sarah, as a therapist yourself, I'm kind of interested in what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is so rich here. I'm going to try to keep it all tied together and not get too tangential, but there's so many different ways we could go here. So, it's interesting to me that kind of like this, we jumped off from the Bitcoin conversation, right, to talk about, and then start talking about regulation in the psychedelic space. I think that this was, spoken at the conference as just like, these are two communities that are kind of resistant to, and, the concept of the psychedelic community or psychedelic communities or movement, however we want to say it, and the cryptocurrency, like allergic to rules, regulations, right? Like the existing, like you were saying, Izzy, like the existing rules, regulations, we don't like them. We want to build new ones, right? And so, but throughout, I mean, I kind of see things systemically and psychologically. So like throughout history, right, whenever we try to create a new system, it's just going to perpetuate the same system unless we address the underlying, really the root causes and the underlying issues. And I think that, this is where it intersects, I think, with institutional violence and trauma that really does, starts at the individual level and at the ancestral and familial level, and then it radiates out from there into families and communities and societies and systems, right? So it's like we have these tools, whether it's cryptocurrency or psychedelics, right? And there are these tools that can be used for all kinds of things. And I think that there's both, I've seen this both with crypto as well as with psychedelics, this whole magic bullet philosophy, like this is the Jesus that's going to come and save us all, right? Crypto is going to save us all. Psychedelics are going to save us all. And it's like, no, right? We're learning that, like, okay, where's the integration? Where is the container? And a lot of what I think MAPS has done in multiple contexts, whether it's research or policy or harm reduction, is tried to create containers where there are not existing containers. So when I think of regulation, I think of that as a container, right? How can we create, like you were saying, Betty, structures that do support the safety and wellness of people who are engaging with these systems? And also, I think that the creation of those containers also includes, how do we not continue to perpetuate the violence of those systems, right? So how does cryptocurrency not continue to just amplify and perpetuate those systems? How do psychedelics not continue to just perpetuate, whether it's psychedelic business or industry or an individual practitioner, or the entire movement itself, right? How does it not continue to perpetuate those systems? And that's where I think like the intersection of individual healing and systemic healing really comes into play. And I think it's really important for each of us as to start with ourselves as individuals, and navigating, our own traumas, so that we're not continuing to perpetuate violence with those that we come into contact with, or the systems that we engage with and play with and interact with, right? And then the other thing that comes up for me is like the peer support model, right? So Betty, you were speaking to, you were all speaking to this piece of regulation. And I do think that, the mental health crisis right now is really calling for, we need more than just traditional therapy. We do need more. And that system is is just like all the systems that are crumbling before our eyes right now. That mental health system is fundamentally flawed, and it's broken because of this systemic trauma. So how can we, this is back to including too, like who's making these rules, whose voices are at the table. And I think that if it is just the people who have been privileged enough to get the degrees, to get the training, to then be able to, call themselves a therapist, I think that we need to revisit that, right? So where can peer support models come in? Where can more shamanically or indigenous medicine models come in of people who've been doing this work, not in a therapeutic format, but in a more ceremonial format, right? So how can those voices and how can those people and their experience be brought to this conversation to help guide those? I guess I'll just say to help build that container, because that to me feels like maybe a safer way of saying it than like build the regulations. But obviously when you're working in policy or you're working and you're playing the game, you have to use that term regulation, right? So how can we maybe play that game, but also see it as like what we're really doing, which is creating a safe container? Because as you were speaking to, Betty, like if you don't and that's one thing that we've seen with Zendo and with this work in general, is just as psychedelic use has increased over the years. There's so many, these are such powerful substances. There's just so many places where things can get confusing, and people, I think it is really beneficial for us to create systems that help people navigate these spaces.
So much of what you said was just like so on point. So thank you, Sara. Like fantastic. And I love the metaphor, but also just acknowledgement of regulations as containers. I think that helps a lot as we get closer to the superstructure, the wizard behind the curtain and so on. We're like, what are these regulations? Like, and understanding that we're talking about container building. It's super helpful. I think that one thing that I heard in both what you were saying, Betty, as well as what you were saying, Sara, is this, someone literally just said the word balance, this balance exactly between urgency and quality, capacity, accountability. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but this goes to what you were saying earlier, Mike. Like, even 3 years ago, I think we were just at a tipping point around understanding the mental health and overdose crisis, or like the related crisis around despair deaths, around a lot of these like secondary effects from extreme income inequality, from poverty, from years of ecological and environmental and economic degradation. So I think we're at a point now where the urgency of need is a little bit clearer to people. Like, I think that almost everyone has a member of their family who's been affected in some way by suicide or by drug use, or problematic drug use disorder, or something that shows that there's something off about the way that society is operating, because it's pushing so many people, pressuring so many people in a certain direction. And I think that this goes to what I think we're talking about here, which is how do we hold and be aware of that level of urgency and in some cases desperation that people have, while also having the integrity, ethics, and duties that we need to have to actually be holding that space responsibly. And I think Sara put it really well, this balance between kind of highly specialized care, medical care, and peer support. I like to think of it as kind of like a graph, I guess, or like a slant, where the more impacted a person is, the more psychological distress, intergenerational trauma, identity-based trauma they're dealing with, the more likely it is that they'll need more specialized care. Whereas for healthy normals, or well people who may not have a diagnosis, who may not have the same either, maybe they haven't had the privilege of having the care to get the diagnosis they need, or maybe the opposite, they've been forced the diagnosis without their will by the state. Either way, like maybe there's a way where like we need to figure out how to capture this like group of people that don't necessarily fit because they're not necessarily at the margins, or they're not necessarily in the mainstream. So I think like balancing the quality of care that's available for different kinds of populations is going to be is part of the reason why looking at this from a full spectrum lens of medical, peer support, working with local governments, working with these different environments, because people will continue to fall through the cracks unless we make sure that there's services available for them at the level that they're currently at. Not everyone's ready to to go into their deep trauma care. Not everyone's ready to stop using a different drug. Not everyone's ready. And we can't be pushing people into that. And that goes to this kind of more voluntary consent-based, like, how do we actually step into a way where we're in our own responsibility, but also actually being cared for by the various systems, which now that we have local governments and maybe eventually state governments putting funding and resources toward this, we might actually be able to say, oh yeah, we actually do have a system that can catch you. Maybe we don't have to be just in this kind of renegade, how do we fill the blanks while the government is fighting to kill us all, kind of energy. And I think that's starting to shift a bit. This is a little bit related to this like a larger arc, which I think is interesting, that came up in Tulum. And since then, I can't believe we went to Tulum, by the way. Like, I just have to pause and just, especially with everything that's been going on with people going to Tulum and like all of the COVID, and I'm not even going to go into that right now. It's so deep and it's just like hard and hurts, but I'm just still in awe that that was like a thing that occurred. But what I was going to say is the shift from research to treatment, and this shift from research to care. I think that for many, many years, a psychedelic kind of policy movement, but also this like research around, or the movement around science and research and evidence, was really focused on this kind of brain-based drug development, like what are the things that it does and how does it do it, research oriented. Even with SSDP for the longest time, people wanted to be psychedelic researchers. That was like a thing that was like really inspiring to myself, to many, as younger people. And I've noticed this big shift toward an interest in therapy and treatment and care. And I love it. I'm all about the research. It's great. But like, as a somewhat cynical, policy advocate, I know that, evidence is not the only thing that drives policy. And in fact, policy is moved in opposition to evidence. And that drug policy is a great example of that. But I say that because science and evidence can only take you so far. There's a lot of work that has to be done at the community level, changing hearts and minds and so on. And I think this idea that if not medical care specifically, but care-based treatment or treatment-based care, kind of that angle, I think, which is part of why what's going on in Oregon is cool, because it opens that up beyond just people who are within a particular medical kind of system. And I think that like shift does show a maturity also of the movement, of a realization that there's major urgency. We have to figure out how to build the capacity for people to actually hold space for each other, because there certainly aren't enough therapists and psychologists. And as Boone so beautifully said on that panel, we can't trust just psychology to be holding the flashlight, like we all got to be bringing our lights forward. And I appreciate how this conversation around treatment, which is really just forms of care, which is really just forms of support, and the various kind of layers and discrepancies between those allows us to actually have a broader view, a more realistic, a more practical, bigger picture view than I think we could have imagined even 3 years ago, even though it's now more real and in some ways more difficult than ever too.
I keep circling back to this notion of urgency in my mind, because 3 years ago when we were in Tulum, I was thinking a lot about, as a person who works to change public perception, right? And as within our movement, particularly the harm reduction movement for people using stigmatized drugs, was confronted with this, decade-long urgency of the overdose situation. I was thinking a lot about how people feel like they can change something, right? So it is the case that when you present a person with an advocacy opportunity and tell them you can change one life, or you can do this one thing for this one person, very discrete notion, it's far more compelling than here is this enormous problem and you're going to have a tiny little impact on it. But all of these tiny little impacts come together to make a big impact, right? And we know as advocates, as philanthropists, as community organizers, as people trying to change the world, that both of those things are true. And sometimes at scale, you get more done. And sometimes in this smaller, more urgent sense, you get more done. But the thing that the overdose crisis and the approaches that we were taking to opioids and was really challenged by was a lack of a sense of urgency outside of people who were directly impacted. And so if you look at Parkland, if you look at natural disaster response, if you look at responses to singular events, communities come together, they knit together, and they work quickly and effectively to support each other and create change, right? But for these urgencies that are drawn out and don't have such a profound and immediate impact, it is very difficult to get people to work together to fix the problem in the same kind of way. And so this also relates to this question of like evidence, the scientific evidence, the research framework, the psychological framework that we've placed psychedelic reform into as a matter of necessity. And because we know that this is, these substances can be quite good as catalysts for therapeutic work. And think about the urgency that we know to be there, to be real, around generating new approaches to psychedelics, new approaches to people who use drugs, new approaches to our relationships with drugs as, a society. I'm still left wondering, how do we increase the sense of urgency without, moving so fast that we're leaving people behind? And I don't know that I have any good suggestions or answers for that. I just see, I know that I'm seeing these problems continue, and perhaps even exacerbate in our increasingly complicated world where, many of us now are looking at the mental health urgencies and emergencies that are coming along with COVID, the pandemic, the isolation, and the economic devastation that so many people are experiencing, and think about how a lot of people are going to benefit tremendously from psychedelic, or could benefit tremendously from psychedelic therapies. Today, now, in this moment where we are, with the amount of trauma in the world seems to be growing so quickly. And that's kind of a downer. I hate to be Betty Bummer on that one. Like, I don't really know what the answer is. I know that we're working on it, but it never feels fast enough.
I can say something just about, because it goes back to what you were saying earlier about like inside action, outside action also.
Yeah.
In the sense that I think a lot about this concept of the just transition. And you said it at the end, right? How do we move forward without leaving people behind? And this was my main critique at CryptoPsychedelic too. And I said this to a lot of people. But it's like, how do you take these like massive social, political, cultural leaps and bounds in a way that actually brings people along with you, so you don't just end up on Mars looking back on Earth as it rebuilds? And I think that the availability of these concepts for the average person is also becoming more permeable, which is also meaning that there's, I think, more availability, more room for everyone who has a lot of different interests, like not just therapists, not just researchers, not just policy people, whatever, like, because this issue is so tied into these bigger issues that are happening in society. There's a way where the conditions that create trauma, that perpetuate trauma, that we can work on them in a lot of different segments of the world and society without necessarily even having to bring in the psychedelics. And I think that, I've been thinking a lot about how over the last few years, a lot of people have gotten the call, they have an experience, or maybe they see the research or something, and they're like, wow, I need to like bring my, energies to making this more available and bringing this forward in a good way. And in some ways, I really love the enthusiasm, and I think it has created a lot of generative kind of change in the world. And I noticed the same, and this is what you were saying earlier, Betty, like I noticed the tendency to reproduce the system in their ideas. And I'm like, why is there such a lack of imagination in the way that we do so? And it comes back to me as like, this is the way people know how to make change. This is what they've been taught are the ways that they can make change. And whether they're doing inside action, whether they're staying within the system because that's how they feel safest, so that's just what they know. Maybe they haven't been taught, these other routes. And I think that's a big part of where I see this movement really offering something to the larger cultural conversation, that it's possible to hold the complexities and contradictions of what's occurring now and where we're at now, with the possibility that there's actually a more imaginative visionary future that's possible if we actually like take a leap toward it. But people are incentivized to do what they know, and I think that even though psychedelics do provide in many cases, you know, a level of courage or confidence in one's like action and ability to do things, it doesn't always come with the compassion or the willingness to take that extra step. And you talked about this, Betty, at the conference on the day of. So I think that thinking a lot about, bringing in this question of container is not just like what is safest or what are the rules that we want to bring in, although it's also that. I think it's also like, what will the story of psychedelics ultimately be? Because the context in which they occur will be the ones that then have the ripple effect to shape the world that we live in. And that's why we need to have every option possible. Like, you know, I obviously within reason, I'm like all about creating like really strong in integrity containers, but making sure that there's a breadth of them, I think is going to be really important. So.
I love that. Actually, I want to give some reflections on that, and then start going to questions from the audience. But I love what you're saying about thinking more outside of the box. You know, let's think of new creative solutions, and if only we had some tools that can help you think outside. Oh, wait. And so, what would be more? You know, what's a crypto psychedelic thing? Well. Right now we're taking psychedelics, but we're still trying to put them in the box. We're trying really, really hard to put them in the box. But what if we actually did the opposite? What if we were using the psychedelics to try to expand the box itself? And this is the difference between, hey, let's, you know, make sure, you know, and while this is important, let's get people access to therapy, access to psychedelics to treat PTSD, depression. What if we were to address the more root causes of, the point of psychedelics being not to address symptoms, but to address root causes in an individual, but put that out to the systemic level. If we are treating all this epidemic of depression and trauma as just these isolated cases, we are now going right back to treating symptoms and not treating the actual underlying problem. So maybe we can use psychedelics to think about what are the new systems, we can use psychedelics to give us insight into what are the new types of economies that cryptocurrency, for example, could help with. Betty, you mentioned COVID and what's happening here. And it's always blown my mind since this whole thing started, the conversation around, oh, well, we can't do this, that, or that because the economy. And I always thought like, wow, you're solving for the wrong problem. The problem isn't the economy as an abstraction. The problem is, can people eat? Do people have roofs over their heads? They have beds to sleep in. And we grow enough food to feed everybody. We have enough beds to house everybody. So the question isn't like the economy. The question is, again, is matching gifts to needs. So I would love, what's a crypto psychedelic thing? I would love to see people using psychedelic insights to think of better ways to right the economy. And maybe that's using crypto. Maybe it's other things entirely. Maybe there's a cryptocurrency that has universal basic income baked into the cake. You know, a quote that Izzy, you brought up that you were quoting Joe Tafur on is not waiting for the state to drive culture. So cryptocurrency being it, maybe there's the cryptocurrency. If the government's not creating UBI, maybe there's a crypto that does. And if we communally decide to accept it, that could change things real fast. That could help with a lot of the trauma and prevent a lot of new trauma from being created. So there's some hot takes on that. I want to take questions, but Sarah, did you have something you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I think you and Izzy just inspired me to just put a plug in for integration, right? I think a lot of why things aren't actually landing. I mean, I think many of us are familiar with an experience of having an experience and then being like, wait, how can I not apply this to my life? How come that huge experience that I had with all of that awareness and that huge awakening and all of these insights, how come the results of that is not actually landing in my life? Why are my behaviors not changing? Why are my relationships not changing, right? So I think that this is like, once again, it's like micro to macro. I think it's part of it's an issue of integration, right? Like people are going, they're being inspired to go back and change those systems that they're a part of. But as long as they're still in the consciousness of scarcity, of privilege, of you know, the idea that if they're going to change a system, that they're going to, you know, that it's going to be resulting in a loss for them, right? That's a perpetuation, I think, again, of that traumatic violence, right? That just is like, well, I want to change this. And we're seeing this right now with, you know, the DEI movements and the Black Lives Matter. It's just like, there's this conversation of like, it's not as people are having to look at how they're benefiting from these structures, right, of privilege, and people don't want to look at that. And so psychedelics can help people see that, but in order to actually integrate those realizations and actually put those teachings into practice, it really takes, I think it takes community support. I don't think that we can do it alone, and I think that's one of the, you know, one of the major foundations of the illness and the trauma of our system is that individualist, right, perspective. And so I do think that it requires integration, and it also requires integration in community for others to hold us accountable. And so, yeah, those are just a couple of things I just wanted to add to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
I feel like that's actually a good segue into one of these questions.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, one of the questions in here is, what is being done to make the psychedelic renaissance more inclusive? Different races, gender, sexual orientations from major organizations like MAPS or the Zendo Project. Any changes you have seen since the 2018 Tulum conference? Maybe I can just go into that, since that
Go for it. Yeah.
Really directly ties into what you were sharing, Sarah. Well, I mean, you know, there's a few ways to answer this question. One of them being, how has the field in general changed? There was a long, you know, Ife and Oriana and talked a lot on the panel 3 years ago around, you know, the stigma of why some people are less likely to be visible in the first place. Like, why is it that we had a lot of white guys, like over the last 50 years, that happened to be the ones that felt the most confident and the least likely to kind of be at risk and putting themselves out there? And I think that partially because of the work of and kind of the efforts of people who do have a lot of privilege in different ways, it's becoming safer, not safe, I would say yet, but safer to be more open and visible. So I do think over the last 3 years, there has been a huge increase in organizations and initiatives, projects all over the United States and all over the world that has brought a lot more POC leadership forward. And I think like that in general will probably continue to increase as it becomes easier, safer. And a big part of that is this question around like legal or at least decriminalized environment. So I do think that in general, there has been an expansion, which has been really amazing to see. And it's really, I think, again, maturing the conversation in the field in a way that's beyond just a kind of a more narrow, whether it's research-based or really like kind of white-centric, kind of America-centric perspective that's really starting to shift, I think, which is super cool to see. And then for MAPS, sorry, we've done, you know, there's, again, a lot of ways to look at it, but I would say one of the biggest pieces of MAPS's kind of long-term work is this health equity plan that we recently kind of introduced and brought forward, which is really focused on this primary output for MAPS and the MDMA therapy program specifically around who is actually trained to train therapists and also trained to offer care. And I think that because the way psychedelic therapy especially works is one where the person who's holding space has such a powerful role, making sure that they're trained, not only that they're trained to work with a wide variety of populations, but that the identity of the therapists themselves actually represents the demographic of the United States, the demographic more broadly. So there are actually people who are not, you know, I'm not a person that necessarily believes that the therapist has to have the exact same experience as the person who they're working on to work. You know, like I think that is broader than that, but there's absolutely no doubt that having a more diverse demographically, racially, et cetera, cohort of practitioners, whether it's for MDMA therapy or psychedelic therapy more broadly, or space holding, peer holding, is going to be probably one of the biggest factors in its accessibility. Cost is going to be a huge factor, but I think who's actually able to offer the care is going to be another major one. So MAPS' health equity program is part of like making sure that we're putting a lot of resources and energy internally, and also kind of inspiring hopefully other organizations externally to actually prioritize this in the way that the work goes forward. So that's one level. And then, you know, more broadly speaking, I would say this bigger move to make sure, and we talked about this, you know, we all talked about this in Tulum, is making sure that the excitement around psychedelics don't leave these other drugs behind, or people who use these other drugs behind. Like the original idea of the just transition has to do with like the energy economy. Let's say we all jump to a new kind of energy, great, but a lot of the world will continue to use oil. How do we phase it out? How do we phase these old ways that people do rely on out, so there's something else happening? And I think similarly here, thinking about how to phase in and make sure that we don't actually lose the other people who are by volume most impacted by these big scary systems we keep talking about, like making sure that those things stay related. I think that's a big push, that as more corporate interests enter and there's more pushback, as you said, Mike, like because corporate interests who are working in legal markets will inherently be kind of seen as, or they will see themselves as being in opposition to access through non-commercial means, making sure that to make the future space more inclusive and available for so more people can belong. It's not just about like lowering the cost, it's actually making it so corporations are not the only ways that people have access to these substances. So that's like a kind of a way that it can be done, but there's a lot to be doing in the meantime. So
I want to add to that actually, and this relates to some crypto values. The particular open sourcing is a big value in the crypto community. And so, and a lot of the corporate psychedelic startups showing up, right, are doing old model of secure the intellectual property. They're showing up, trying to figure out, where can I plant my flag? How can I get a patent? And this is the big difference between, if you look at what Compass Pathways is doing with psilocybin, and this is a for-profit venture capital backed company taking psilocybin through FDA trials for major depression or treatment-resistant depression. And they threw spaghetti at a wall enough times till they got a patent issued around psilocybin, which is controversial. Whereas USONA Institute, which is a nonprofit that is also working to take psilocybin through the FDA trials, in their case for major depression, they're open sourcing everything. MAPS, right, has open sourced what they've done. And I think at one point, I know Rick has talked about having an anti-patent strategy of just publishing publicly as much as possible, to have there be art already that someone can't come back later and say, oh, well, this is something I invented. And so I think one of our best defenses against sort of like corporate attempts to monopolize and secure territory in the space, and to try to take ownership over things that are really the rightful inheritance of the commons, the best thing that we can do is open sourcing. So very much aligned with what the crypto philosophy is about.
This is why we fight for home grow.
Yes, home grow. Yeah, if something's legalized without a home grow, like what are we doing? We kind of missed the memo.
Well, I will say it depends, just practically speaking, as someone who understands the value of regulations, like, you probably shouldn't have like a lab making synthetic drugs in a residential area. I think that's a reasonable thing that we can do. If we had legal regulation, we could actually kind of affect that. Right now, because it's illegal, people just do it anyway. And I say that as like, well, yeah, it's like we want to reduce, like, this came up in the cannabis conversation too, right? It's like, where do you have BHO extraction? Like, where do you have like big machines that can do scary things? It's like, once you legalize it and you actually create then obviously that can be used negatively too, but it is helpful to see where home grow is a big part of it, and like making sure that we can do our own thing is a big part of it. And I know there's also a whole layer of this movement that are like kind of the biohacking community that are like, screw it. Like, I should be able to have a giant pressure gauge, whatever the heck, in my house, so I can do whatever I want. Honestly, I'm with it. Like, I'm down to have the conversation. I'm here for the conversation.
Right. Well, I think there's a conversation probably to be had about a home lab. Certainly, I think we can say growing some weed or some mushrooms in your closet. Like, come on. What?
Or in your backyard. Outdoor.
Or in your backyard. Yeah.
I can't wait for the MDMA farm licenses to come out.
I've long had a dream that in the future we have like, orchards of sassafras trees that are used where the labor is paid equitably, where there's fair trade, like sourcing of precursors, instead of it having to be like ecologically devastating or like from petroleum derivatives. Like imagine having groves of like ethically sourced MDMA that's like coming from organic sources. Like that's a thing that's possible in the future. Like we could do that in the future. Right now it's hard. and yeah.
So if I may, Izzy and I have both been involved in this project, this thought project, right, with Drug Policy Alliance, but initiated from the Canadian Drug Policy CDPC, a Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, called, with them, it's called the Regulation Project. You can find it online. I'll drop a link in a minute. But the, it's getting together a bunch of people who think about how are we ultimately going to legalize, decriminalize, regulate drugs. And a couple of moments today that's come up for me. One is like, where's your imagination on it? How can you think outside these boxes? And when Izzy and I were in a small working group together on this, people had such an incredibly difficult time separating themselves from where we are to where we really should be. The mandate of that conversation was just imagine what is possible, what would be most ideal, forget everything that we need to move people from. And over again, even the most revolutionary thinkers were saying things like, well, it's going to be really hard to get people there. But and so creating that imaginative space is tremendously challenging when you're coming from such a prohibition-based environment, a patronizing environment where we have to like make sure that people can't get their hands on things that might possibly hurt them unless they're sanctioned, like drugs or like nicotine or sugar or alcohol. Anyway, I've been a user of all of those things in my life, and so no shame there, no judgment, but like, the socially sanctioned versus what isn't. But it comes up too in this sense of like, okay, once we're there, what do we do? How do we make sure that these systems of production and distribution are just and acknowledging the past, right? And there are some really interesting notions that folks have around how we approach regulation of drugs in the future. I'm going to bring up two that are out of context for psychedelics, but both for opium gum or poppy tea and for cocaine. Folks in Mexico, Colombia, and other production countries are talking about transitioning the existing farms where people are generally coerced into growing these products into farmer co-ops that are benefiting from the growth of these products, the production of these products, and their distribution into regulated markets. And so the imagination, once you get past where we are today, it's extraordinary to think about how we can create reparations for some of the harms that have been done through our more standard economic models. If we just stop being so fear-driven in our policies.
Hear, hear. Anything else to add on that question? All right, then let's answer the next question. So the next question we have is there research being conducted on psychedelic medication use in the geriatric dementia population and for end of life? And I think any of us could probably answer that question. Whoever wants to grab it first. And I can start. No one wants to jump on it. Or Izzy, were you about to say something?
I'll just say that I noticed that Betty posted something from clinicaltrials.gov. That's definitely the best way to like know all of the studies that are going on for all of the things. MAPS has done some studies on end-of-life care, end-of-life anxiety with MDMA, and there are some well-known studies of psilocybin with it as well. And the end-of-life care angle, I think, is probably one of the most, probably one of the top 2 or 3 most visible kind of narratives around like how we do end-of-life care and end-of-life anxiety and the implication of psychedelics for that. The first time that I like really saw it, I mean, it's been part of the conversation for a long time, but there was actually a conference in like 2017 probably the University of Washington School of Law that was specifically focused on like palliative care, end of life, psychedelics, and so on. So it's definitely a thing. It's one of what I think will be a number of, and this is actually a big question, which is like what what indications all of these substances end up getting utilized for. And I think that it's not as clear cut as it is with some substances. So it's definitely the case that people have been doing that kind of research, and it's worth taking a look.
Yeah, I mean, end of life care is one of the big areas psilocybin has been used for, and at Hopkins and NYU, other places, it's a very big. Initially, the research we're seeing now for FDA approval on psilocybin for major depression disorder and treatment-resistant depression, it was initially based on research on for depression of people that were facing existential depression, cancer patients who are at end of life, and that was expanded for this phase of FDA. It was expanded beyond just people at end of life to broader depression. But end of life care is actually one of the biggest areas that psilocybin's been researched on. As far as dementia, I know Hopkins is doing some research on Alzheimer's and psilocybin. That's fairly new. And again, though, it's not about psilocybin to treat the Alzheimer's itself, but it's to treat the depression associated with the Alzheimer's. Although it'll be interesting to see if their data does end up showing, even though this isn't what's being explicitly studied, if there is any effect on the Alzheimer's or the dementia and maybe itself. I would certainly be interested, as I've had, there's been dementia in my family, so that would be interesting to see. If there's any other questions too, remember we've got this Ask a Question feature, so be sure to plug in a question there if you've got more to ask us. We've got only a few minutes left, but if there's more questions you want us to get to here, please feel free to chime in.
If I may, Mike, I just want to add in here too that I think that we are sort of I know that we are at the precipice of an explosion into research into all sorts of different we're looking at MAPS, at psychosomatic illnesses or illnesses or conditions where mental state can have a very significant impact on physical state. There's a growing body of work around conditions such as fibromyalgia and their relationship with the brain or the body, and a much greater understanding of how our microbiome impacts our health and wellness. And I think that as we start to recognize just how tightly integrated our bodies, our minds, our guts, are overall, we're going to see many more opportunities to learn how our minds are able to learn how mental health, what is couched as mental health care treatment, might impact these things. So just to say, like, there's going to be a lot more out there coming soon, I think, in terms of research of dementia, Alzheimer's, and other brain conditions. I know that there's, furthermore, people are starting to look into the impact of psilocybin on CTE and other brain injuries, right? So there are physical injuries to the brain, which we can think of Alzheimer's and dementia as being in that category, that might be helpfully addressed through psychedelics, whether that's psilocybin or others. So I would encourage the Googling on that one.
I think that's one of the most fascinating, frontiers of the research, because in some way the research to date has been kind of things we already knew the answers to. We kind of already knew what was going to happen if you're giving MDMA to someone with some trauma, or if you're giving psilocybin to someone with depression. There was a lot of prior research on all this stuff back in the days, and also, of course, experiential understanding that this is what psychedelics do. And I think one of the underexplored areas is to what extent can psychedelics, which are thought of as this thing, as a mental health, it's more of a mental health thing, but to what extent can they actually affect physical conditions? And there's so many anecdotes about this that are full range from things that you say, oh, that's interesting, to like, wow, wait, what? Paul Stamets talks about he doesn't stutter anymore, and you could say that's more. You could more think about this as like a mental thing than like maybe a physical thing. But there's all kinds of, or people with tinnitus don't hear buzzing in their ears anymore when they're on MDMA, or cluster headaches go away there's all these weird things that when you start to really investigate the mind-body connection. I think it's fascinating. And in some cases, some of the people that were in the Johns Hopkins cancer studies, their cancer went into remission. And they didn't do enough data to say that statistically it was a significant number of people. So I'm not saying that, but I met people when I was in Baltimore that had been in the Hopkins study. And then after they had their psilocybin, their cancer went into remission. And these people are still hanging around. So I think it's a fascinating area of research.
I'd like to share something just as we're closing, and all that stuff is true and super exciting, and I'm really glad that it's there. But I'll be Bummer Betty. What'd you call yourself earlier? Just because, one of the things that I really worry about moving forward is the way that, and I talk about this a little bit in the talk that I just put into the chat, the way that our current kind of advertising marketing infrastructure is going to get linked to psychedelics. And I think it is really important that people know the benefits and they demystify the hysteria and actually understand the facts and so on. And, for so many years, MAPS's work was to mainstream psychedelics and bring them to the mainstream. I don't know if everyone that I work with would agree with this, but I personally believe that 2020 was the year where psychedelics went mainstream, which means that we now have a whole new set of things and people to deal with, including what the aspects about the mainstream that we don't necessarily love or agree with. And I think that one of the ways that I think people within this kind of movement and in this space who are trying to make sure that it moves forward in a really good way can do that is by not just being an evangelist. And you talked about this earlier, Sara, about the silver bullet kind of, and I'm not saying that this is what you're doing, Mike, at all. I know that you understand this nuance, but I just want to share for the audience, you're more, you have more authority and you will be trusted more if you give the whole story, which is that all of this healing is possible and that there are risks, which brings us back to that conversation about regulation and containers. And I just want to frame it so the audience really understands this. The reason people go into this conversation about regulations, about the policy change and so on, I think, at least my motivation, I think a lot of the people that I work with and around, I feel like a lot of it has to do with making it so it's as safe as possible. Dr. Carl Hart just released his book, Drug Use for Grown-ups, and a big part of the argument he makes is that for most people, most drug use is very safe. And I think that that's true. And I think that what makes it safer is knowing what can go wrong and what things we have to be careful of. And we will not be able to trust big corporations to tell this to us because they will be incentivized otherwise. And I think for MAPS, and I say this internally, I've said it to you all, I feel this way really strongly. I think for MAPS to continue its own legitimacy and to not lose the trust that we've built over a long time, it's to make sure that we're giving the whole story, which includes the research and it includes the reality of the political situation. And it also includes recognizing when things can go wrong and to referencing back to the work that Sara is doing. It seems like as we make this visible, people having psychedelic crisis isn't going to start with Denver decriminalizing or mushrooms, right? Deprioritizing mushrooms. But now that they've done that, they can actually admit that people are doing it without having to throw them into this whole kind of current criminal system. And they can say, oh, these are people that we actually want to help. Now let's keep that energy, let's keep that energy for the other substances. I think we all should be asking for unarmed crisis response. I think period, armed crisis response is not necessary for the overwhelming majority of kind of emergency calls that happen. There's good evidence for this. There's good data for this, including places like Denver and other places where you have shifts away from that paradigm. And I think that to me would be the single biggest, would have the single biggest impact on the field and the safety of people who are in whatever context, ceremonial or therapeutic or whatever. It's how do we deal with this enforcement question to make sure that people who are responding when things do go wrong are not going to make it worse?
Hear, hear. I agree to all that. And yeah, and I definitely am concerned. Yeah, I don't think we should advertise these as silver bullets. I don't want to see billboards, like, have you experienced depression? Have you tried mushroom? I think that's the Black Mirror future of psychedelics.
Well, I just want to say a quick note that in Oregon, advertising for the substance, the product itself, will not be permitted, but advertising for the services or the places will. So you won't have, it's not like buy my psilocybin, it's like come to this retreat center or work with this person. So it's going to be really interesting to see how the advertising landscape.
That'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. Well, cool. So we're coming to the end of our session here, although there is more. This is actually part 1 of a 3-part series. So the second part of CryptoPsychedelic Flashback is going to be 1 month from today on March 7th. And that's going to be veering more onto the crypto side of things. And then April 11th, we're going to combine what we've learned in all of these sessions here. Also today, there's still more. We're going to have the virtual hangout space with Azo, the virtual beach hangout. We're going to pop the link just below this video as soon as this is over, and also in the chat. And we're going to keep hanging out with each other. I'm going to be hanging out there. Maybe some of you all will join for a bit. We'll see. So we can keep hanging out today, and there will be another session in a month. Before we close it out, were there any kind of parting thoughts that you wanted to leave folks with?
Well, Mike, I want to say, as one of many testaments to what you've been able to put together here since you've entered the event curation space, I've noticed that the number of attendees to this panel has gone up since we started, which almost never happens with online events anymore. And so I want to point that out as a way to say thank you for all of the care and talent that you bring to that work, and for having us here for this conversation, for getting us to Tulum in the first place, which is somewhere I might never have gone otherwise, and creating a really unique experience 3 years ago, and an awesome event here today.
Thank you. And as far as getting you to Tulum, I think Matt is to thank for that. But I guess I got to influence who we brought. So that was my pleasure.
Yeah, I just want to echo that I think that event curation, as well as events like this, online event webinars, are also a form of holding space and creating space. So thank you for doing that for us.
It is my absolute pleasure. And I'm really honored to have all of you here and to be doing this with you all. Yeah. Cool. So yeah, thank you all. It's always awesome having a jam with you, on screen or in person or off and hanging out in all the forums. So big thanks to the 3 of you for joining me here today, and everyone who's watching us. This is only the beginning of this series, and there's way more to come. I'm going to be heading to the virtual beach right now, so I'll catch you all out there. Thanks so much, and may the force be with you all.